Welcome back to Vuln Vibes. In this deep dive, we are going to talk about the Jira vulnerability that's been making substantial waves in the threat intelligence community and really causing headaches for every sysadmin running Atlassian Service Management. We are specifically diving into a high-severity flaw in Atlassian Jira Service Management data center and server. This is the kind of vulnerability that, well, it makes your stomach drop because it provides a surprisingly low-friction path to full server compromise. We're tracking JSD Server 16409, also cataloged as CVE-2025-22167.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here, and frankly pretty terrifying, is the risk calculation involved.
Yeah.
It's a classic path traversal vulnerability, chained to an arbitrary file right. The CVSS score sits high at 8.7, which is significant, sure. But the real issue, the kicker, is the accessibility of the exploit chain itself. This is not some, esoteric exploit needing deep memory corruption knowledge. No, it's a logical flaw, and it grants a critical primitive to an attacker who only needs authenticated access. And we're talking the lowest possible privileges here.
That's the absolute crux of the matter, isn't it? When you look at the enterprise attack surface, Jira is deployed everywhere, and nearly every employee, contractor, or maybe even customer has some form of authenticated access, even if it's just, viewing tickets. So the mission here is urgent. We need to unpack exactly how that low privilege authentication translates into a critical system breach. Define the scope of damage, and most importantly, provide the operational strategies Atlassian and the security community recommend to mitigate this immediate risk.
Agreed. We are dealing with an urgency level that really requires security teams to treat this as an active threat, almost like a 0 day, even if the patch is out now. Because the time between disclosure and widespread weaponization for flaws like this, well, it's measured in hours, not weeks.
Okay, let's unpack the core flaw then. We know it's rooted in JSD Server 16409, let's call it 16409 going forward, just to keep the pace up. It's categorized as a high-severity arbitrary file write vulnerability. Now, for our listeners who are security practitioners, why is a path traversal? This is a vulnerability class we've been dealing with since, the 90s? Why is it suddenly appearing in hardened enterprise software like Jira Service Management? What mechanism are we actually looking at here?
Well, it really boils down to incomplete or maybe flawed input validation in how Jira handles certain file operations, specifically within certain authenticated actions. A standard path traversal attack involves manipulating input parameters, right? Often file names or paths. You try to inject sequences like, .. And the application, instead of sanitizing or just rejecting that input, it trusts it. It uses it to construct a file system path that escapes the intended sandbox directory.
Right. So instead of writing a temporary file in, say, jargam, the attacker manages to redirect the right operation to something like Cedrid maybe, or more dangerously in this context, the web root itself.
Exactly. The vulnerability occurs because the application logic fails to canonicalize the path correctly before performing the right operation. And because this path manipulation is possible with only authenticated access, we're talking minimal user role here, the barrier to entry for an adversary is practically non-existent. You are dealing with potential lateral movement before the attacker has even established persistence, just by leveraging, say, a basic ticket viewer account.
This raises a critical point about the chain of exploitation then. The arbitrary file write isn't the endgame, is it? It's the primitive, the tool that facilitates the ultimate goal, which is almost always remote code execution, RCE. What's the most common pivot from an arbitrary file write to RCE in a Java application environment like Jira?
The immediate move, the classic one, is to use that primitive to write a malicious file into a directory that the web server or application server will actually execute. Since Jira Service Management runs on a Java backend, well, the adversary targets the web root or maybe a context folder that can execute server-side scripting. Usually that means dropping a JSP, a Java server page file. So if the attacker successfully writes a file like shell.jsp into an accessible web directory, boom, they now have a persistent web shell. They can connect back to that URL, and the server executes arbitrary system commands. And crucially, it executes them under the privileges of the Jira service account. That jump from authenticated help desk user to system command execution, that's why this 8.7 CVSS flaw is being treated as an immediate critical incident.
That makes the blast radius feel enormous. Okay, let's specify the affected artifacts because inventory teams really need this detail. Which versions of Jira Service Management Data Center and Server are in the crosshairs here?
Right. This issue affects all service management deployments, starting with versions 5.1, 2.0, and 10.3.0. So if you're running anything between those initial versions and the patch versions, you are vulnerable. And this spans a large segment of currently deployed instances, making rapid asset inventory and triage absolutely paramount. We're not talking about some obscure end-of-life version. We're talking about currently maintained enterprise software.
Okay. Given that enterprise risk profile, let's drill down into the potential damage outside of just achieving RCE. Let's say an attacker can't immediately pivot to a web shell. Maybe there's some restrictive controls in place somehow. What other catastrophic outcomes can they achieve with just this arbitrary file write capability?
Well, an arbitrary file write means you could essentially destroy system integrity almost instantly. Even without RCE, they can overwrite critical configuration files. For example, overwriting server.xml or other core configuration files. That can immediately lead to a denial of service, taking down a mission-critical ticketing system just like that. Or worse, they can modify logging mechanisms or authentication handlers. Imagine an attacker modifying a config file to maybe redirect all incoming session tokens or credentials to an external endpoint they control. Now, the attack shifts from just impacting availability to potentially large-scale credential theft and deep persistence. This primitive allows attackers to manipulate the application's core operational logic directly from the file system level.
That's a profound thought, really. This vulnerability weaponizes the inherent trust the application has in its own file structure. Okay, so let's pivot hard to defense then. Atlassian's primary recommendation, and ours too, is pretty simple. Patch immediately. The fixed releases are 5.12.29 and 10.3.12. Get those installed. But we all know the reality of enterprise environments. Sometimes complex patch cycles mean you can't just hit the button today. So what does the robust defense in-depth strategy look like for intermitigation? What can people do right now if they can't patch?
Right. This is where we stop talking just about reactive patches and start talking about architectural resilience, proactive hardening. We need to deploy hardening strategies that directly neutralize the severity of the arbitrary file write primitive, even if the underlying vulnerability still exists temporarily. And the absolute non-negotiable cornerstone of your interim mitigation must be the least privilege principle, specifically applied to the Jira Service account itself.
Okay, let's spend time here, because this is the critical dependency you mentioned earlier, right? The permissions. How does an organization properly scope down the file system permissions for a service account like Jira's? I mean, by nature, it needs some right capability to function for logs, temp files, uploads, data.
It requires meticulous auditing and essentially sandboxing. First off, the basics. The Jira Service account must not have write access to any critical OS directories. Things like etc., bin, userb. That's standard security hygiene, hopefully. But more importantly, it must be stripped of write permissions and directories that would facilitate RCE. Specifically, you need to lock down the entire web root where application code is executed. Think Tomcat web apps folders, places like that. The service account should only have write permissions to highly restricted data directories and maybe the logging folders it owns. So if the attacker manages to traverse the path and attempts to drop a malicious shell.jsp into, say, that web apps folder, the write should fail. Not because the app blocked it, but due to lack of operating system permission for the service account. That is your effective neutralization strategy. If the primitive can't write to an execution path, the RCE chain is fundamentally broken.
That shift from a functional flaw in the code to a permission issue at the OS level, that's key. So even if the path traversal itself succeeds, if the application's user account doesn't have the capability to write outside of its designated data sandbox, the severity immediately drops from that critical 8.7 RCE down to something far lower. Maybe denial of service, maybe less. That's the difference between a potentially minor incident and a full system breach.
Precisely. That's why we talk about containment. And beyond least privilege, we absolutely have to consider network segmentation. If the Jira instance is only accessible internally, okay, you limit the attacker pool to authenticated internal users, still a risk, but smaller. If it's exposed externally, which is common for service desks, then rigorous WAF rules and network ACLs are definitely required, though frankly, authenticated path traversal. It's a nightmare for WAS to reliably block without generating tons of false positives. It's tricky.
Right. WAFs are generally better at protocol enforcement, maybe SQL injection patterns. But detecting subtle logical bypasses in authenticated sessions is extremely challenging. Which brings us to the third defense in-depth layer, detective controls, logging and monitoring.
Yes, we need high-fidelity logging and, ideally, immediate alerting. Proactive monitoring for file write activity is essential here. You should be specifically looking for file creations or modifications happening in unusual locations outside of the expected data or log or temp folders. Or maybe files with suspicious extensions like .jsp, .php, .esh, or even configuration files being dropped into directories that typically only contain static application resources. Think of this as your tripwire. Even a successful write attempt that ultimately fails due to lack of permission, that should still trigger a high-severity alert. It clearly indicates an active exploitation attempt is underway. The ability to detect and maybe isolate a compromised, low-privileged Jira user account before they can find an alternative escalation path is paramount.
Okay, so to bring this all back around, we've covered the mechanics of JASD Server 1649, high-severity path traversal, low-privilege authentication requirement. And this vulnerability isn't just a simple coding error, is it? It's a stark reminder that application security is fundamentally a layered defense. It begins with secure code validation, absolutely, but it must be backed up by hardening the runtime environment itself.
Absolutely. This incident really highlights the perennial vulnerability of relying solely on input validation, especially within complex enterprise platforms like Jira. You could have robust authentication, strong passwords, all the good stuff. But a single flaw in file handling, leveraged by a user with minimal privileges, can entirely bypass those controls. It can yield full system compromise if the service account privileges are overly permissive. That's the if.
So the ultimate resilience against these types of logical RCE chains, it always comes down to enforcing that crucial separation of duties between the application's runtime identity, its service account, and the host operating system it runs on. It forces us, and everyone listening, to ask that uncomfortable but deeply technical question. What underlying assumptions are you making right now about the functional privilege and the right capabilities of your internal application users, and more specifically, the service accounts they operate under?
Yeah. If you haven't reviewed and actively locked down those service account permissions in the last, say, 6 months, consider this your urgent call to action. That's the real deep dive here, understanding and mitigating that risk.